President Trump did something just today that some are calling an act of war. What we are now hearing is that Russia is going up against the United States, and here in the US and as well as in Europe, we need to be extremely cautious because there will be some type of an attack. But according to reports, it will not be a physical attack. It would be likely a cyber attack because of what is currently happening. But look at this. It says US sanctions Russia's two largest oil companies and calls on Moscow to agree to an immediate ceasefire. Well, we're starting to get new reports. These reports are indicating that Vladimir Putin has no intention of a ceasefire. He doesn't care at this point. And what he's trying to do is he wants all of Ukraine. He is not content with Ukraine accepting that Russia has invaded their country and taken control over, I think, like 20% of Ukraine. So what we're hearing right now is that Russia is going to continue. This is where President Trump has pretty much got himself stuck in the middle, because right now he has told President Zelensky of Ukraine he would not be sending those Tomahawk cruise missiles because it takes some time to learn how to use them, and that the United States is not going to send out our resources so that Ukraine can potentially sit on them and do nothing. It would be a waste of time. And then he said, according to Pentagon officials, we can't just send a Tomahawk cruise missile and hope they can figure it out. That would be completely devastating. Look at this, though. Putin calls U.S. sanctions unfriendly act and says Russia won't bend. I want to play you this clip from President Trump. Okay, this is just from yesterday. Listen to this.
Why do you believe, Mr. President, that the sanctions that you're announcing today will push Putin to the...
Well, I don't know that they will. I think that they'll certainly have an impact. They're massive sanctions. It's sanctions on oil. The two biggest oil companies, among the biggest in the world. But
one thing I just want to add really quick before we jump back into this is that these are two very large oil companies. If the United States sanctions these companies and in any countries that are buying oil from them, what then happens is Russia sees less revenue. Russia's economy is going to take a hit. And as it does, we are going to see them pretty much lose control over how much they can influence this war, which then means we're going to see other countries jump in and help. This is where Iran, North Korea, even China are going to help out. And the U.S. understands this. This is why some believe that what President Trump just did in this announcement of sanctioning these Russian oil companies, this is going to be an act of war, which is likely going to cause some type of cyber attack here inside the U.S. and also in Europe. This is what they're talking about. Let's keep listening.
they're Russian. They do a lot of oil. And hopefully it'll push... hopefully he'll become reasonable, and hopefully Zelensky will be reasonable too. You know, it takes two to tango, as they say.
I want to say one other thing, and then we'll listen to this last question. But President Zelensky of Ukraine and Vladimir Putin have to come to an agreement as to how to end this war. President Zelensky, he wants his entire country back. President Trump and many European leaders say that's highly unlikely. And then Vladimir Putin is not accepting the fact that they've already taken 20% or more of Ukraine, and he actually wants the entire thing. But let's keep listening to this.
Still believe that Putin wants to take all of Ukraine?
I always felt that way. I always felt he wanted to. When I was in my first term, I was with, I was very close to him, relatively speaking. It was harder because of the Russia hoax. But I would talk to President Putin about Ukraine, and it was the apple of his eye. I'd say it was the apple of his eye. But it would have never happened. He knew the consequences were too great. When we had a rigged election and all of a sudden I wasn't there, he said, wow. I think he looked at Afghanistan, how horribly that was handled, so stupidly. And I think that really gave him a little additional, incentive.
I do want to point out one other thing. President Trump mentions Afghanistan, and when we pulled out of Afghanistan, Some say it was just horrible. It was not the right time, wasn't the right move, so many mistakes. This is also why many experts believe how the United States and how NATO nations handle these threats. For instance, when we are seeing Russian jets flying off the coast of Alaska, how quickly did the United States scramble fighter jets to get that plane outside or further away from U.S. airspace? We've seen the same thing with, down in the Caribbean as well, when we saw a Russian submarine. What was it, just off of Cuba? 80 miles off of Florida, right? Remember this last year. How quickly did we get boats to that location? Those, according to experts, were tests. That's essentially what's happening right now when Russia had, according to reports in Poland, there were the Satski region or Satski Boot. What happened was we were seeing Russian soldiers in unmarked military attire in the area. And that had people completely spooked. And now, and just the other day, we learned about this, okay? Where Vladimir Putin was testing nuclear missiles after the Trump meeting collapsed. After President Trump and Vladimir Putin decided they would not be meeting in Budapest. That happened just the other day. And so what's interesting about all this, and I'm going to show you another thing, is that Russia doesn't seem like they're content with where they're at. They're going to do everything in their power to try to get bigger, more powerful. Look what happened. It says Russia acquired Western technology to protect its nuclear submarine fleet. It says Russia secretly used front companies to buy Western technology and erect a surveillance net in the Arctic where its submarines operate, according to an investigation. How do you think that's going to go? That Russia secretly used a front company to buy Western technology to protect their nuclear submarine fleet. Do you think that goes over well with President Trump? Do you think that goes over well with NATO? No, it's not. And that's why it's going to be a huge issue. But look at this. I want to play you the rest of this clip, and then I want to show you one other article. Listen to this.
I always felt he wanted the whole thing, not a piece of it. But I think now he's willing to negotiate a little bit further, and I think he's willing to make a deal. We'll see.
Mr. President,
We don't want him. We don't want him to have the whole thing.
Yeah. The U.S. and really any country doesn't want Russia to have all of Ukraine. Okay, just because Vladimir Putin doesn't believe in Ukraine and what they've been doing and pretty much their entire being. He doesn't care. I want to show you one last thing, though. Look at this right here. It says, Ukraine welcomes new U.S.-EU sanctions against Russia as top Russian official declares them an act of war. It says, Ukraine's leader welcomed a raft of new economic sanctions against Russia being imposed by the Trump administration and the European Union on Thursday. He says it is very important. Says the sanctions are a win for Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, but despite President Trump's open frustration with Russian President Vladimir Putin, who has refused to negotiate a truce, American pressure on Moscow has increased only economically so far, not with the provision of long-range additional weapons, or even with overt permission to launch attacks deeper inside Russia. It says right here, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent encouraged allies to join in as he announced the new U.S. sanctions on Wednesday. Says the EU heaped new economic sanctions on Russia Thursday as part of a broadened effort to choke off the revenue that funds Moscow's 3-year invasion of Ukraine and compel Putin to negotiate to end the war. Here's where things get very interesting, though. There's a lot of pressure for Vladimir Putin to end this war. However, just threatening Russia doesn't do what we need it to do. In order to see this work, the United States would have to pretty much play hardball with China. The same thing with the EU. We would have to impose stricter tariffs on China because of what they're doing with Russia, buying their oil. ensuring that they are still in business and helping them fund this war. If we do that, if we have stronger or much bigger tariffs on China, or we see the EU do something very similar, it's going to hurt millions of people financially. Then, and only then, according to reports, that is when they expect we are going to see some type of cyber attack in the US and even in Europe. That's what we're hearing. So, I don't want you to be alarmed just yet, but right now, there's a reason why President Trump could not send these Tomahawk cruise missiles to Ukraine to have them as a threat to Russia. That right there would have been an escalation of war. Just sending the weapons there. Not using them, just sending them. Putting these weapons in the Ukrainians' hands. That's something President Trump didn't want to do. So now, according to reports, President Trump is walking a very fine line to figure out how can we get Russia to come to the negotiation table and pretty much sit down and agree on this is what has to happen for us to reach a ceasefire. But according to reports, Vladimir Putin has no interest in a ceasefire because he wants all of Ukraine. So, we'll see what happens moving forward, but that is what we know as of today. So again, thank you guys for watching. Consider subscribing, and I'll see you guys on the next one.